For our 10th anniversary dinner, my husband walked into the Michelin-starred restaurant not with a diamond necklace, but with his 23-year-old pregnant mistress. I didn't cry. I took action. 48 hours later, his meticulously constructed reality collapsed and he never saw it coming. To understand the sheer magnitude of Mark's audacity, you have to understand the decade that preceded it. 10 years of marriage is a long time to serve as the invisible scaffolding holding up the grand, glittering facade of someone else's life. When I met Mark, he was a second-year law student drowning in six-figure debt, living off ramen and his mother's sporadic, guilt-inducing handouts. I was already working 60 hours a week, building a boutique commercial real estate firm from the ground up. I paid his rent. I paid his tuition. I bought the tailored suits he wore to his first prestigious interviews. I did it because I believed we were an impenetrable team. I believed his success would inherently be our success. That was my first mistake, though it would take nearly a decade for the receipt to finally come due. Mark was the golden child of his family. His mother, a leaner, an insufferable woman who treated passive aggression like an Olympic sport, worshipped the ground her son walked on. In a leaner's eyes, Mark was destined for greatness, and I was merely the pedestrian stepping stone required to get him there. She never missed an opportunity to casually remind me that Mark could have married a politician's daughter or a fellow attorney rather than a woman who spent her days dealing with contractors and zoning permits. This constant, suffocating coddling bred a terrifying strain of entitlement in him. Mark genuinely believed the universe existed solely to serve him. He believed he was the architect of our wealth, completely blind to the fact that I was the one pouring the concrete and signing the checks. The shift in his behavior began 8 months before our anniversary. It wasn't an abrupt, dramatic change, but a slow, creeping erosion of his presence. He started working late, citing grueling settlement negotiations and demanding corporate clients. His phone, once casually tossed on the kitchen counter, became permanently glued to his hand, always placed face down. Then came the financial anomalies. Minor at first. $500 here, $1,000 there, quietly siphoned from our joint checking account. When I first noticed a missing $4,000, I approached him calmly in his home office. He didn't flinch. He looked me dead in the eye, wearing that practiced, charming courtroom smile, and told me I was losing my mind. It was textbook gaslighting. He smoothly insisted that I was overworked, that the stress of managing my properties was making me paranoid, and that I had explicitly authorized the transfer for his country club dues weeks ago. He even manufactured a fake memory of our conversation, detailing exactly where we were standing in the kitchen when I supposedly agreed to it. I let out a short, humorless laugh in the quiet of my own mind. He thought I was weak. He thought I was foolish. He forgot that my entire career was built on auditing complex contracts, finding hidden clauses, and tracking corporate assets down to the final decimal. I don't forget conversations. And I certainly don't misplace $4,000. I didn't argue with him. I simply nodded, apologized for my confusion, and quietly closed the office door. That was the exact moment our marriage ended. The grief lasted approximately 20 minutes. It was a sharp, suffocating pain in my chest, a brief mourning for the decade I had wasted. But then, a profound and icy clarity washed over me. My blood ran cold, and the weeping, devastated wife he might have expected was entirely replaced by the ruthless businesswoman he had completely underestimated. I hired a private investigator the very next morning. A quiet, unassuming man named Thomas who specialized in high-net-worth matrimonial disputes. It took Thomas exactly 4 days to hand me a thick manila dossier that completely unraveled my husband's secret life. Her name was Chloe. She was 23 years old, an aspiring lifestyle influencer, and coincidentally, the newest receptionist at Mark's law firm. But the high-definition photographs of them kissing outside a luxury boutique weren't the worst part. The worst part was the accompanying financial report. Mark wasn't just buying her expensive dinners. He had signed a 2-year lease on a luxury penthouse downtown. He was funding her designer wardrobe. And, as the medical bills routed to a hidden secondary credit card proved, he was paying for her high-end prenatal care. Chloe was 5 months pregnant. He was building an entirely new family using the empire I had financed. For the next 7 months, I played the role of the devoted, slightly oblivious wife to absolute perfection. I swallowed the bile in my throat every time he kissed my cheek before heading over to her apartment. I smiled pleasantly across the dining table while he lied to my face about his exhausting hours. I even attended his mother's agonizing Sunday dinners, nodding politely as Alina praised Mark's tireless work ethic, all while knowing her precious son was funneling our money to a mistress's nursery. I used that time. I used every single hour. Behind the scenes, I was meticulously building a paper trail that would withstand a nuclear blast. Because Mark, in his infinite arrogance, had never bothered to look closely at the legal structures of our wealth. When we bought our sprawling estate, he was too busy celebrating his promotion to read the final deed. When I restructured our LLCs 3 years ago to optimize our tax burden, he blindly signed the documents I placed in front of him, trusting my business acumen completely. He had no idea that he legally owned virtually nothing. The house, the lucrative investment properties, the primary holding company, they were all locked in a complex irrevocable trust under my sole control, legally insulated from any aim he might ever try to make in a divorce court. As our 10th anniversary approached, Mark told me he had planned a special surprise dinner at Le Petit Chateau, the most exclusive restaurant in the city. He told me to wear the emerald silk dress he loved. He told me it would be a night I would never forget. He was absolutely right about that. I arrived at Le Petit Chateau precisely at 7. I wore the emerald silk dress, just as he requested. I paired it with the diamond tennis bracelet I bought for myself 3 years ago, a quiet reminder of my own financial independence. The maitre d' led me to a secluded private dining room at the back of the restaurant. Heavy velvet curtains, antique chandeliers. The perfect stage for a tragedy, or in my case, an execution. Mark was already seated, but he wasn't alone. Sitting next to him, clutching his hand like a terrified toddler, was Chloe. She was wearing a cheap maternity dress that strained over her swelling belly. When I walked in, she actually had the audacity to give me a small, pitying smile. Mark stood up, smoothing the lapels of the custom Italian suit I had paid for. He looked entirely too calm. He looked like a man who believed he held every single card in the deck. "Sit down, Victoria," Mark said. His tone wasn't apologetic. It was commanding. The tone he used with junior associates. I didn't sit. I stood at the head of the table, perfectly still. "I know this is unconventional," Mark began, gesturing for me to take the empty chair opposite them. "But I wanted to do this face to face. Like adults. Chloe is pregnant. It's a boy. And since you've always been so focused on your career, so unwilling to slow down and build a real family, I had to look elsewhere for that fulfillment." He was trying to flip the narrative. Classic Mark. Make the victim the villain. "We aren't getting a divorce," he continued smoothly, picking up his wine glass. "Divorce is messy and expensive. I like our life. I like our house. I want my son to grow up in the house. So, here is how this is going to work. Chloe is moving into the guest wing. You are going to respect my boundaries as a father. We can maintain our public image and you can continue playing business tycoon, but under my roof, we are going to be a blended family. If you try to fight me on this, I will drag your companies through a divorce court so brutal it will bankrupt you." He took a sip of his Cabernet. He was so incredibly proud of his little speech. He expected me to scream. He expected me to throw a glass of wine to create a scene that would confirm his narrative of the hysterical, unstable wife. He expected me to shatter. Instead, the heavy oak door of the private dining room swung open. A man in a sharp charcoal suit stepped inside, carrying a thick leather briefcase. Mark frowned, annoyance flickering across his handsome face. "Excuse me, this is a private room. Who are you?" "Mark," I said. I kept my voice steady. "I'd like you to meet David. He is the senior partner at Harrison and Vance, my legal counsel." Mark's confident smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. "Victoria, what is this? I told you, we aren't getting lawyers involved unless you force my hand." David pulled out a chair next to me, unlatched his briefcase, and placed a pristine, 3-inch thick stack of legal documents onto the white linen tablecloth. He slid the first folder toward Mark. "Actually, Mark," I said, leaning forward slightly, "you don't have a hand to force. You don't even have a seat at the table. What the hell are you talking about? Mark snapped, his voice losing its polished veneer. He didn't touch the folder? Open it, I said. Chloe nudged his arm, her eyes wide with sudden panic. Mark, what's happening? He snatched the folder and flipped it open. His eyes darted across the pages, scanning the complex legal jargon. I watched the exact moment his brain caught up with reality. The room went dead silent. Their faces went pale. His face, specifically, drained of color, turning a sickly, ashen gray. The smug, commanding lawyer vanished, replaced by a man staring down the barrel of total financial ruin. This isn't right, Mark stammered. His hands began to shake slightly, rattling the paper. The house. We bought the house together. It's community property. It's a shame you didn't read the deed when we closed, I replied, my voice dropping to a low, conversational whisper. Or the LLC restructuring documents you signed 3 years ago. If you had, you would have noticed that the primary estate, along with all the investment properties, were transferred into an irrevocable trust. A trust where I am the sole beneficiary and trustee. You don't own the house, Mark. You are simply a guest whose welcome has officially expired. David seamlessly slid a second document across the table. Notice of eviction, David stated, his voice devoid of emotion. You have exactly 1 hour to collect your personal clothing from the residence. The locks have already been changed, and private security is currently waiting in the driveway to escort you out. You can't do this. Mark finally yelled, slamming his hand on the table. The wine glasses rattled. I'm your husband. I am entitled to half of everything. You are entitled to the assets in your name. I corrected him. Which, according to the forensic audit we completed this morning, consists of a checking account with a balance of $400, a leased Mercedes you are 2 months behind on, and approximately $180,000 in outstanding law school loans. I let that sink in. Speaking of debt, David interjected smoothly, handing over a third file. This is a comprehensive itemized list of the marital funds Mr. Vance unlawfully diverted to support his paramour. The total comes to exactly $85,420. We have filed a civil lawsuit for the immediate restitution of these funds, since you used joint assets to secure the lease on Ms. Miller's apartment without my client's consent. We have also notified the landlord. The lease is being terminated. Chloe let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth. Terminated? But where am I supposed to live? I'm having a baby. I turned my gaze to her. Cold, unblinking. I suggest you ask the man who promised you the world. Mark was hyperventilating now. He looked frantically from me to David, then down to the documents that dismantled his entire life piece by piece. His carefully constructed illusion of power was disintegrating right in front of his mistress. Victoria, please, Mark choked out. The arrogance was completely gone. He wasn't demanding anymore. He was begging. We can talk about this. You're acting out of anger. I understand you're hurt, but you can't just throw me out on the street. I have nothing. You have exactly what you earned, I said, standing up from the table. I smoothed the front of my emerald dress. I am going to enjoy a very expensive steak now, and you two are going to leave. You have 55 minutes left to get your suits out of my house before security throws them on the lawn. I turned my back on them and walked toward the door. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The sound of Mark's frantic, ragged breathing and Chloe's sudden, hysterical sobbing was the perfect soundtrack to the end of a decade. The steak was exquisite, medium rare, perfectly seasoned. I ate it in silence, savoring the absolute peace of a room devoid of parasites. By the time my driver pulled up to my gated driveway, the private security firm had already executed their orders. 2 large, expressionless men in black suits stood flanking the front door. On the manicured front lawn sat 4 large garbage bags. Not suitcases, garbage bags. I had specifically instructed security not to let him access the master suite's luggage closet. Mark was standing near the curb, pacing frantically, aggressively jabbing his thumb into his phone screen. When he saw my car, he lunged toward the wrought iron gate, but it remained firmly locked. I didn't roll down the window. I didn't offer a final, dramatic parting word. I simply looked at him through the tinted glass as the heavy gate clicked shut. He looked small, He looked pathetic. He looked exactly like the broke, desperate student I had met 10 years ago, completely stripped of the unearned arrogance I had funded. The next morning, I woke up at 5:30, went for my usual 3-mile run, and arrived at my office by 7. Business as usual. At precisely 9:15, my personal cell phone began to vibrate. The caller ID flashed a name I had been expecting, Eleanor. The matriarch. The enabler. I let it ring 3 times before answering. I kept my voice steady. "Good morning, Eleanor." "Victoria, what on earth is going on?" Her voice was shrill, completely abandoning her usual faux aristocratic drawl. "Mark called me at 3 in the morning. He says you threw him out. He says you're trying to steal the house and leave him penniless." "I haven't stolen anything, Eleanor. I simply reclaimed what belongs to me. He is your husband." She shrieked. "He made a mistake. A momentary lapse in judgment because you have been so emotionally unavailable. You are his wife. It is your duty to stand by him, not throw him to the wolves over one little indiscretion. An indiscretion is a drunken kiss at a holiday party, Eleanor. Funding a second household and impregnating a 23-year-old receptionist is an alternative lifestyle." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Mark clearly hadn't mentioned the baby to her yet. A baby? She stammered. But it only took her 3 seconds to pivot. The mental gymnastics of a narcissist are truly a marvel to witness. "Well, if that's true, it's even more reason for you to be reasonable. That child is going to be my grandson, the golden grandchild of this family. You cannot expect Mark to provide for his new family if you ruin him financially." I let out a short, humorless laugh. It wasn't a joke. It was just astonishing. "His new family is not my financial responsibility. If you don't let him back into that house and drop this ridiculous lawsuit," Eleanor threatened, her voice dropping to a vicious hiss, "I will make sure everyone in our social circle knows exactly what kind of cold, vindictive woman you are. I will launch a smear campaign so brutal you'll never do business in this city again." Ah, the smear campaign. It was the only weapon she had left. "Eleanor," I said softly, leaning back in my leather office chair, "I strongly advise you to reconsider that strategy. Because if you breathe a single word of this to the country club, the charity board, or your bridge group, I will personally ensure that every single one of Mark's corporate clients and the State Bar Association receives a copy of the forensic audit detailing exactly how he embezzled funds. I will destroy his career before lunch." The line went dead silent. "Furthermore," I continued, "this is the last time you will ever speak to me. Consider this the official establishment of my boundaries. We are strictly no contact from this moment forward. If you attempt to call, text, or show up at my property, my security team will have you arrested for trespassing." I hung up and blocked her number. It was incredibly liberating. Of course, Mark didn't go down without a fight. Over the next 3 weeks, his legal strategy shifted from aggressive denial to pathetic desperation. He hired a bulldog divorce attorney, a man famous for dragging out proceedings and bleeding the opposing party dry. He demanded alimony. He demanded a 50% equity payout for the house, claiming his emotional support contributed to my business success. My lawyer, David, merely smiled when we received their initial filing. It was a bluff, and we both knew it. Mark couldn't afford a protracted legal battle. His credit cards were maxed out, his checking account was frozen due to our civil lawsuit, and his prestigious law firm had abruptly placed him on indefinite administrative leave, pending an internal ethical review. Funny how law firms despise bad PR, especially when it involves a senior associate sleeping with a subordinate and misusing marital funds. I didn't pack my bags and flee to a tropical island to heal. I didn't take a leave of absence to process my trauma. I stayed exactly where I was, sitting at the head of the boardroom table, expanding my portfolio and watching his life implode from a comfortable distance. By week 4, reality finally set in for Mark. Chloe, having realized that her wealthy, successful lawyer boyfriend was actually an unemployed, broke fraud facing a massive civil lawsuit, did what any aspiring influencer would do. She left him. She moved back into her parents' basement in the suburbs, taking the leased Mercedes with her, which was repossessed 3 days later. Mark, homeless and abandoned by his pregnant mistress, had no choice but to move back into his childhood bedroom in Eleanor's cramped, floral wallpapered house. The golden child returning to the nest in absolute disgrace. It was exactly what he deserved. But I wasn't finished. The divorce proceedings had only just begun, and I had absolutely no intention of offering a settlement. I wanted the $85,000 back. Every single cent. Even if I had to garnish his future wages for the next 20 years to get it. He had wanted to play a high-stakes game with my money. Now he was going to learn the true cost of losing. I authorized David to file an emergency motion for summary judgment on the embezzled funds. We attached every bank statement, every forged signature, every unauthorized transfer. The evidence was mathematically and legally insurmountable. There would be no negotiation, no mediation, and certainly no mercy. The trap had fully snapped shut. The legal system is a slow grinding machine, but when fueled by irrefutable evidence and limitless capital, it becomes a meat grinder. Mark's bulldog attorney, a belligerent man named Richard Thorne, attempted the standard delay tactics. He filed frivolous motions, requested absurdly broad discovery into my companies dating back to my college years, and demanded a gag order to prevent me from disparaging his client. David dismantled each motion with the surgical precision of a seasoned sniper. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with zero tolerance for unprepared counsel, threw out Thorne's requests one by one. The turning point of the divorce wasn't a dramatic courtroom shouting match. It was a Tuesday morning deposition in a beige conference room overlooking the financial district. Mark sat across from me, sweating through his off-the-rack shirt. It was jarring to see him without his custom Italian suits. He looked deflated. His mother had clearly been ironing his collars, but the crisp, commanding aura of Mark Vance-esque was entirely gone. Thorne sat beside him, looking distinctly annoyed by his own client. "Mr. Vance," David began, his voice perfectly modulated. "Let's discuss the series of wire transfers made from the joint checking account between March and November of last year. Specifically, the said two transactions routed to an account ending in 43459. Mark swallowed hard. Those were living expenses. For the household. Living expenses, David repeated dryly. He slid a thick binder across the table. "Could you turn to page 42, please? This is a bank statement for the account ending in 43409, which we subpoenaed. It is registered to a MS. Chloe Miller. Can you explain how a $4,000 transfer labeled Country Club dues was used to purchase a customized rose gold crib from a boutique in Paris?" I watched Mark squirm under the fluorescent lights. The room went dead silent. He looked at Thorne for a lifeline, but Thorne just stared at the document, his jaw tight. When your client lies to you about the paper trail, defending them becomes a public humiliation. I may have mislabeled the transfer," Mark stammered. "You committed bank fraud," David corrected him politely. "You used joint marital assets, under false pretenses, to fund a mistress. A mistress you then attempted to move into my client's home." Thorne cleared his throat. "Counsel, let's keep the inflammatory rhetoric out of the record. My client acknowledges some financial irregularities, but we maintain that he is entitled to a standard of living payout based on the 10-year duration of the marriage." That was the moment I leaned forward. I kept my voice steady, locking eyes with Mark. "You don't get a standard of living payout when you actively siphoned away the funds required to maintain it. And you certainly don't get alimony when your firing from the firm was classified as terminating with cause." Mark flinched. "They didn't fire me. I'm on leave. I packed my bags for a weekend conference in Chicago last week," I said smoothly, ensuring every word landed perfectly in the stenographer's transcript. "While I was there, I had a very illuminating dinner with your managing partner, Stephen Harrison. He informed me that the internal ethics review concluded on Friday. You violated the firm's morality clause and misused company resources to conceal your affair. You were officially disbarred from their partnership track and terminated. Your severance was denied." His face drained of color. Again, it was a reaction I was starting to truly enjoy. Eleanor hadn't been able to protect him from the corporate consequences of his own ego. The deposition lasted 6 hours. By the end of it, Mark had admitted, on the record, to the embezzlement, the affair, and the attempts to coerce me into an open marriage arrangement under duress. Thorne looks like he wanted to crawl under the table. Psychologically speaking, Mark was trapped in a zygarnik loop. He couldn't process the sudden, violent termination of his comfortable life because I refused to give him the explosive emotional confrontation he craved. He wanted a screaming match. He wanted me to cry, to hurl insults, to give him a reason to paint himself as the victim of an unstable, hysterical woman. By remaining perfectly cold and legally surgical, I denied him that closure. I left his brain spinning, desperately trying to solve a puzzle where I held all the missing pieces. But the true masterpiece of that week was Eleanor's spectacular miscalculation. Desperate to save her golden child from financial ruin, she decided to take matters into her own hands. Since I had established strict boundaries and initiated no contact, she couldn't harass me directly. So, she went to the one place she thought she had leverage, my biggest client, a massive tech conglomerate looking to lease 100,000 square feet of prime downtown office space. Eleanor somehow managed to corner the CEO, a man named Arthur Pendleton, at an exclusive charity gala. She fed him a tearful, entirely fabricated story about how I was a ruthless, vindictive woman who had stolen her son's money and cast him out on the street to starve. She warned Arthur that doing business with someone so devoid of basic human empathy was a massive corporate liability. It was the smear campaign she had promised. She truly believed her country club tears would sway a billionaire CEO. Arthur Pendleton called me the next morning. He didn't cancel our massive commercial contract. Instead, he laughed so hard he choked on his espresso. "Victoria," Arthur wheezed through the phone, "your mother-in-law is an absolute piece of work. She just spent 20 minutes trying to convince me you're a criminal mastermind." "I apologize for the intrusion, Arthur," I said, suppressing a smile. Her grasp on reality has always been somewhat tenuous. "Don't apologize. It just confirmed exactly why I hired you," Arthur replied. "If you can financially dismantle a cheating husband and his meddling mother without breaking a sweat, you're exactly the kind of shark I want managing my real estate portfolio. Let's add another 10,000 square feet to the lease." Eleanor's desperate attempts to ruin my career had just netted me an extra $200,000 in annual commissions. I almost sent her a thank you bouquet, but I decided the absolute silence would sting her far more. Mark's situation, meanwhile, was deteriorating at a rapid pace. With zero income, a mountain of mounting legal debt, and an impending civil judgment against him, he was completely trapped. He tried calling me from blocked numbers. He sent pathetic, pleading emails, begging for a private meeting to work things out. He even tried to use his unborn child as leverage, claiming that by bankrupting him, I was starving an innocent baby. I didn't reply. I simply forwarded the emails to David to add to the harassment file. Mark had made his choices, and now he was going to live with them. I was just the executor of the consequences. The sheer audacity of him expecting me to finance his personal redemption arc was truly astounding. He still hadn't learned that I was no longer his financial safety net. I was the concrete floor he was rapidly accelerating toward. Every single action he took only tightened the legal noose I had so carefully constructed around his neck. Silence is the most devastating weapon in any negotiation. People abhor a vacuum. They will exhaust themselves trying to fill it with excuses, apologies, and eventually, total capitulation. For 6 weeks after that disastrous deposition, I gave Mark and his bulldog attorney nothing but absolute, suffocating silence. I instructed David to ignore every single frantic voicemail. We rejected every revised settlement draft Thorne sent over, watching the requested amounts plummet week by week as Mark's financial reality set in. The golden child was finally learning that gravity applies to everyone, even him. By month 3, the pressure became insurmountable. Mark had defaulted on his student loans, his credit score was utterly decimated, and the civil lawsuit for the embezzled funds was officially scheduled for summary judgment. Knowing he was about to be legally steamrolled by an irrefutable paper trail, Thorne begged David for one final mediation session. He promised that Mark was ready to sign a full and complete surrender. I agreed to the meeting, not out of mercy, but because I wanted to look him in the eye when I closed the casket on his former life. We met in the executive conference room of David's firm. The mahogany table stretched between us like a cold, polished battlefield. Mark looked physically ill. The weight of his impending ruin had carved deep, dark circles under his eyes. He wore a cheap, off-the-rack suit that fit him poorly, a glaring downgrade from the tailored Italian wool I used to buy him. He wouldn't even look at me. He just stared at his clenched hands, a broken man who had finally realized the sheer magnitude of his audacity. Thorne cleared his throat, sliding a thin manila folder across the table. "My client is prepared to walk away," Thorne stated, his voice devoid of its former arrogance. "He will sign a quitclaim deed on any perceived marital interest in the house and the companies. He waives all claims to spousal support. In exchange, we ask that you drop the civil suit for the $85,000 and agree to a mutual non-disparagement clause. We can end this quietly today." It was a pathetic, cowardly attempt to escape the consequences of his actions. He wanted a clean slate. He wanted me to simply absorb the cost of his profound betrayal, write off his mistress's maternity expenses as a business loss, and let him quietly fade into the background to Reb. You willed his life. I didn't cry. I took action. I reached across the table, picked up the settlement offer, and calmly tore it precisely in half. The sound of the thick paper ripping echoed loudly in the quiet room. Thorne's jaw tightened. Mark finally looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. Their faces went pale. "There seems to be a fundamental misunderstanding of who holds the leverage in this room," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, steady register. "You don't get to walk away, Mark. You don't get to steal from my companies, finance a secret life, attempt to force your pregnant mistress into my home, and then simply ask for a reset. That is not how reality works. You do not dictate the terms of your own punishment." "Victoria, please," Mark whispered, his voice cracking horribly. "I have nothing. You know I have nothing. If you push this civil suit, I'll have to declare bankruptcy. It will ruin my chances of ever practicing law again. I'll never be able to pay child support to Chloe. You're destroying my life." I let out a short, humorless laugh. "I am doing no such thing. I am simply handing you the bill for the life you destroyed yourself. I warned you about my boundaries. You chose to ignore them, assuming I would simply bend to your will like I always had." David seamlessly took over, placing a new, incredibly thick stack of documents in front of them. "This is the final offer. There will be no negotiations. Mr. Vance will sign the quitclaim deeds and waive all support. Furthermore, he will sign this confession of judgment for the sum of $85,420, plus my client's legal fees." Thorne frowned, scanning the document. "He can't pay this, David. You know he's practically destitute." "We are well aware of his current liquidity issues," David replied smoothly, "which is why we have already drafted the asset seizure paperwork. If Mr. Vance cannot produce the funds within 30 days, we will place a permanent lien on his future earnings. And since he is currently residing at his mother's address, we will be forced to send aggressive collections to that property. We've also noted that a leaner Vance's home has significant equity. Perhaps she'd be willing to take out a second mortgage to save her son from bankruptcy." The room went dead silent. The blood completely drained from Mark's face. The trap was perfect. If he signed, he was a financial slave to me for the next decade. If he didn't sign, I would destroy his mother's financial security to get my money back. He had dragged a leaner into this mess with his lies. Now, he was going to have to explain to her why her retirement was on the line. "You're a monster," Mark hissed, genuine hatred flashing in his eyes. "No," I replied, standing up and buttoning my suit jacket. "I am an auditor, and your accounts are severely overdrawn. You have 24 hours to sign, or we see you in court on Monday." I didn't wait for his response. I walked out of the conference room, leaving him to suffocate in the reality of his own making. He signed the paperwork the very next morning. The divorce was finalized 3 weeks later. The judge granted the decree with a swift strike of her gavel, officially severing me from the parasite that had been draining my energy for a decade. I walked out of the courthouse feeling lighter than I had in years. I didn't celebrate with a wild party or a dramatic social media post. I simply went back to my office, poured a cup of black coffee, and reviewed the blueprints for my newest commercial development. The finalized divorce decree was a piece of paper, but the confession of judgment was a living, breathing mechanism of financial extraction. I didn't frame it, but I certainly admired its utility. Mark, in his infinite, delusion-fueled optimism, assumed that because the marriage was officially over, I would simply lose interest in collecting the $85,000. He thought the divorce was the finish line. He didn't realize it was merely the starting gun for the collections phase. On the 1st of the month, the initial payment of $3,000 was due. Unsurprisingly, the deadline came and went in absolute silence. No check arrived. No wire transfer was initiated. Mark was testing the electric fence, hoping the power had been turned off. I kept my voice steady when I called David the following morning. Execute the garnishment, I instructed, and file the lien against a liener's property. The fallout was instantaneous and beautifully catastrophic. Mark hadn't just lost his position at Harrison and Vance. The ethics violation had effectively radioactive tagged his resume in the corporate law sector. Top-tier firms run extensive background checks, and nobody wants to hire a senior associate who uses marital funds to finance an affair and attempts to defraud his spouse. Desperate for income, Mark had quietly taken a job doing low-level document review at a strip mall personal injury firm. It was a massive, humiliating fall from grace. He was essentially a glorified paralegal, making a fraction of his former salary. And then the garnishment hit. Imagine the sheer shock of opening your already meager paycheck and seeing a massive 25% instantly vaporized, legally rerouted directly to the ex-wife you thought who had outsmarted. Mark's fragile new reality shattered all over again. He called David's office in a blind panic, screaming about unlawful seizure and basic living expenses. David, executing my instructions to the letter, simply hung up on him. There was no negotiation. The paper trail was absolute, but the true masterpiece of consequence was unfolding at a liener's house. When the legal notice of the property lien arrived via certified mail, the matriarch's carefully curated world finally imploded. For decades, a liener had weaponized her modest wealth and social standing, using it to coddle her golden child and belittle anyone she deemed beneath them. Now, that very same golden child was the direct cause of a massive legal encumbrance on her only valuable asset. Because Mark couldn't satisfy the debt, the burden legally shifted to the address he used as his primary residence, leveraging the threat I had established in mediation. To prevent the forced sale of her home to satisfy her son's judgment, a liener was forced to march down to her local bank and take out a high-interest home equity loan. The irony was almost too perfect to articulate. The woman who had constantly mocked my working-class background and praised her son's supposed financial genius was now cutting me a check for $85,000 just to keep a roof over his head. I received the cashier's check on a Tuesday. I didn't deposit it into my personal account. Instead, I used it to fully fund a new community outreach program my company was sponsoring, a grant for young, female entrepreneurs from underprivileged backgrounds. Mark's stolen Mistress fund was now actively financing the exact type of ambitious, independent women he and his mother so deeply despised. Meanwhile, the highly anticipated arrival of the golden grandchild occurred under the most miserable circumstances imaginable. Chloe gave birth to a healthy baby boy, but the glamorous influencer lifestyle she had envisioned was completely dead. Instead of a luxury downtown penthouse and a wealthy lawyer husband, she brought her son home to her parents' cramped suburban basement. When Chloe formally filed for child support, the state took one look at Mark's garnished, entry-level wages and issued an order, so appallingly low it wouldn't even cover the cost of formula and diapers. The rage she felt must have been incandescent. She had traded her youth and her reputation for a man who turned out to be a financial mirage. Mark was now trapped in a purgatory entirely of his own design. He worked 50 hours a week in a miserable, windowless office, only to hand a quarter of his earnings directly to me and another portion to an ex-mistress who actively despised him. He went home every night to his mother's house, where the atmosphere had turned utterly toxic. Eleanor, now burdened with a massive monthly loan payment at the age of 68, no longer looked at him as a golden child. She looked at him as a liability. The endless praise and coddling had been replaced by bitter resentment and constant arguments over utility bills and grocery costs. The smear campaign Eleanor had threatened never materialized. She was too busy trying to figure out how to pay her new mortgage on a fixed income to worry about ruining my reputation at the country club. In fact, she quietly dropped out of the club altogether, unable to afford the monthly dues. They faded from polite society, effectively exiling themselves through their own greed and incompetence. I watched this all unfold from a comfortable distance, entirely detached. I didn't feel joy exactly. Joy implies an emotional investment I no longer possessed. What I felt was satisfaction. The deep, settling satisfaction of an auditor closing out a perfectly balanced ledger. My companies thrived. The commercial real estate market experienced a massive boom, and my portfolio expanded into 2 neighboring states. I bought a vacation home in Aspen. I traveled. I slept peacefully through the night, untethered from the exhausting weight of managing a man-child's fragile ego. People often assume that revenge must be a fiery, explosive thing. They picture slashed tires, burned clothes, and screaming matches in the rain. But true devastating consequence is cold. It is bureaucratic. It is the slow, methodical dismantling of a person's resources and safety nets until they are left standing completely exposed to the elements. It's fascinating how quickly the human spirit breaks when it realizes that manipulative charm has absolutely no currency in the real world. Mark's entire existence had been built on the premise that he could talk his way out of any consequence. He used his handsome smile and his practiced vocabulary to secure my financial backing, to appease his mother, to seduce a naive receptionist. But you cannot charm a bank ledger. You cannot gaslight a subpoena. And you certainly cannot negotiate with a woman who has permanently turned her empathy into a wall of solid ice. For 10 years, I was the unseen engine driving his success. When he finally pushed me too far, he assumed the engine would just quietly sputter and die. He never anticipated that I would simply detach the carriage and leave him stranded on the tracks. 2 years have passed since the day Mark walked into Le Petit Chateau with his pregnant mistress. The dust hasn't just settled. It has completely fossilized over the remains of his former life. I occasionally hear whispers of his existence through mutual acquaintances in the financial district who haven't quite mastered the art of discretion. The latest update is that Mark has completely abandoned the legal profession. He is currently working as a mid-level shift manager at a regional logistics company, coordinating trucking routes on the overnight schedule. It is a profoundly fitting role for a man who spent his entire adult life expecting others to carry his heavy freight. His mother, Eleanor, was forced to sell the family home last spring. She simply couldn't keep up with the exorbitant high-interest equity loan she took out to pay off my $85,000 judgment. She now lives in a modest, dated 2-bedroom apartment in a decidedly unglamorous zip code. I've been told she spends her days complaining to anyone who will listen, mostly bored cashiers and exhausted nurses, about the vicious, calculating daughter-in-law who ruined her PR. Estigious family. I don't mind playing the villain in her pathetic delusions. It keeps me entirely insulated from her reality. As for Chloe, the ambitious 23-year-old who thought she was securing a luxury penthouse and a wealthy husband, she is currently engaged in a bitter, ongoing family court battle with Mark. They aren't fighting over who gets more time with their son. They are viciously fighting over who is legally forced to pay the other's filing fees. They are forever trapped in a miserable, impoverished loop of their own mutual resentment. People often ask me how I survived such a profound betrayal without losing my mind, without compromising my business, or without completely shattering. The truth is, looking back at the wreckage of my 10-year marriage, I don't feel a single ounce of grief. I learned lessons that no MBA program, no corporate mentor, and no amount of therapy could ever teach me. The first and most critical lesson is that trust is a beautiful concept for romance, but it has absolutely no place in asset management. Never commingle your primary assets without a bulletproof legal structure. Protect your peace with a paper trail. If someone genuinely loves you and respects you, they will never resent you for protecting the empire you built before they arrived. The second lesson is about perception and reality. When someone shows you who they are through their financial habits, believe them immediately. Gaslighting isn't always about manipulating your memories or twisting your words. Sometimes it's about making you question your own math. If a partner tries to convince you that the bank statements don't mean what they clearly mean, they are not your partner. They are a parasite meticulously testing your defenses. Thirdly, beware the golden child. Entitlement is an insidious disease, usually bred by a parent who refuses to let their child experience the friction of reality. When you marry a man who has never been held accountable for his own failures, you do not become his wife. You become his new manager, tasked with funding his unearned arrogance. It is a completely unwinnable battle, and the only true victory is absolute, legal severance. And finally, I learned the true nature of consequence. Society conditions women to believe that if we are wronged, we must scream, cry, and demand emotional closure. We are taught to seek apologies, but apologies are utterly worthless when the betrayal is calculated. Forgiveness is a personal choice, but consequences are mandatory. The greatest revenge you can ever inflict upon a narcissist is not loud, dramatic destruction. It is complete and utter detachment. True power isn't making them scream, it is making them entirely irrelevant to your future. I didn't destroy Mark Vance. I simply handed him a mirror and a calculator, and let him bankrupt himself. Today, my properties are thriving, my personal assets are locked down, and my life is exquisitely quiet. The emerald silk dress still hangs in my closet, a beautiful, tactile reminder of the night I stopped being a stepping stone and became the architect of my own absolute freedom. So what do you think? Did I go too far or not far enough? Let me know in the comments below.